So once upon a time, there was a king, and this was no ordinary king. This was a pious, noble, self-restraint king named Gādhī. Imagine, imagine, imagine a leader who possesses self-restraint. um, Such things perhaps are possible. Anyhow, before I continue with the story of this king, I'm Dr. Raj Balkaran, founder of the Indian Wisdom School. This is the Indian Wisdom Podcast, and you are here to enjoy a tale laden with insight on life. So, this great King Gādhī lived a pious life. Now, a virtue might perhaps be said to be universal or have universal reverberations, while, of course, morality very much can be culture defined. Perhaps smacking someone upside the head for no reason whatsoever, but malice or spite is not virtuous, and perhaps that's universal. But a word like pious and piety very much has a cultural and typically a religious inflection. So he was leading a pious life, this king named Gādhī. One person's piety is another's vanity, right? So look, why was his life pious? Well, he was living in the forest, the infamous forest, the famous forest, the place of the space of all things beastly and supernatural alike, perhaps a metaphor for the unconscious, structurally opposed to the grama, to the village, to the city in the forest, the known, the mapped, and the murky, the mysterious, the abode of sages and beasts, and all things in between. Perhaps, this is all metaphoric for the human experience. But anyhow, this king, a king is what? An emblem of the social, of the conscious, of the Apollonian, to use a term related to the god Apollo, structure, order, versus the Dionysian, related to the god of wine, Bacchus, pertaining to less structured impulses. But you see, the king is in the forest. What does this mean? Right? And this is a common trope in Indic myth because it holds within it this really beautiful tension between the inner and the outer life, perhaps between social and spiritual selves. So the great king Gādhī was living a pious life in the forest. And he had a daughter, a beautiful daughter named Satyavati. Not the famous Satyavati of the Mahabharata, but another Satyavati. And so when Satyavati comes of age, a great sage comes along, sages and kings indeed, named Ṛcīka. And Ṛcīka asks for Satyavati's hand in marriage. And she was, of course, quite keen because, of course, who wouldn't want to marry some exalted sage? Who wouldn't want such a wise and noble husband? One imagines that the sage had some sense of personal hygiene and was not difficult to behold, as was Vyasa in the Mahabharata, which is a story for another day. But she was very content to wed the sage. And so she asks her papa, Gādhī, can I marry the sage? And he's like, sure, but there's a condition. Okay. We know that Ṛcīka is a powerful sage and powerful with respect to ascetics, yogins, etc., powerful with respect to spiritual power, not necessarily social power, the wielding of the supernatural, right? They're not muggles. Magic is real. And so his requests pertained to the sage's ability to bless the ability to manipulate material creation, to wield Shakti, to wield power, spiritual power. And so the king says to his daughter, provided that the sage prepares a potion, right? So that myself, right? So that I and my wife may produce a great warrior. This is the condition. Yes, Sage Ṛcīka, you can marry my daughter Satyavati, but you have to prepare a potion, a porridge, a porridge sprinkled with not only, perhaps some, nuts and seeds and wonderful digestibles or edibles, but a porridge laden with potency, the powerful potion, so that I may conceive a warrior who one imagines will succeed this king in time. Okay. The sage said, oh, certainly, no problem. No problem. I can prepare such a concoction for you and your wife. Yes. And while I'm at it, while I'm preparing potions, one loses so much time and energy switching between tasks, answering emails for 5 minutes, and then, thinking about podcasts, and then switching over to do a website, and then answering some more emails. No, carve out an hour and bang off the podcast, carve out an hour and bang off all the emails, carve out, right? We spend so much time switching gears, actually. So much time and energy. We would be much more productive were we to focus on one task at a time until it becomes, internalized or automated somehow in our system. And so, since I'll be preparing potions anyways, I'll prepare a second potion for myself and my to-be wife, your daughter, Satyavati. Okay? Because, I'm a great sage. I'm committed to celibacy. But a child would be nice. And I'm certain that Satyavati would like a child. And so I'll prepare a potion for you and your wife for a great royal warrior. Right? And I'll prepare another potion, less spicy, perhaps, a little more sugar. So that my wife, your daughter, will conceive a lovely sage. There are many ways to think of this, and one compelling manner to think of this tension is through the lens of the gunas, the qualities of nature. This comes from one of the 6 classical Hindu schools of thought, the darshanas. Sankhya philosophy, the philosophy of enumeration, of enumerating, identifying the elements of material creation. This is where we have the famous Purusha and Prakriti, spirit and matter, if you will, right? While this comes from Sankhya philosophy, the gunas pervade, they've been internalized by so much of Indic thought. But so says the theory that all of reality is made of 3 modes: tamas, darkness, inertia; rajas, energy, fire, passion, desire; and sattva, goodness, clarity, light. All things are made up of 3 colors: red, black, and white, for example. So one way to think of this interplay is the interplay between sattva, goodness, clarity, light, perhaps a nature befitting a sage, and rajas, fire, passion, energy, desire, perhaps a nature befitting a king. And so these tales are much more than, they're much more than fanciful conceits for children or story lovers of all ages, and they're even more than historical record. You can imagine that. They are archetypal, or they can be viewed archetypally as pertaining to the very aspects of the human experience. Right? So archetypal tales are tales which last, and tales which grip, and they last because they grip. Because of their grip and power, they stand the test of time because they grip generation after generation. And there are even wise myth makers of our times, or within the last 50 years or so, who have generated profound archetypal worlds, such as the world of Star Wars, quite literally a modern myth consciously crafted from the building blocks of mythology, such as Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. Yes. To a certain extent, even Star Trek, archetypal worlds. And there are lesser, archetypally tone deaf individuals who have taken over these worlds and have tried to make them Lord knows what, gods know what. And they've succeeded actually not only not landing the plane, but sort of blowing it up midair because it doesn't land. Archetypal stories land. You can feel, you can experience the power of a story on many levels, but there's something quite potent about a story that encodes or speaks about the guts of who we are, the human experience. And these are the stories that last. And stories of kings. Well, what's a king? Of course, there are cultural differences between notions of kingship. Nevertheless, a concentration of power, an individual with whom is entrusted order. Yes, very archetypal. Yes. And so we can see the play between sages and kings as a play between the gunas, sattva, and rajas. We can also see the play between ascetics and kings or sages and kings as the play between the inner and the outer. Control of the inner, control of the self, or control of the outer. Society, control of others. Yes. So anyhow, the sage agrees to prepare not one, but two magical brews, potent porridges, two for the price of one. So one night soon after the wedding, the sage retires to his sacred space, his little alcove of wizardry, his Shakti shack, if you will. My goodness, I think I need to create a Shakti shack. That sounds like fun. He resorts to his Shakti shack to engage in this powerful wizardry wherein he imbues two bowls of porridge with two different essences. Okay. He performs powerful rituals, slightly different for each, reciting Sanskrit mantras, enacting sacred hand gestures, mudras, and stuff that we can't talk about because it's so esoteric. But in either case, he succeeds in infusing these bowls of porridge with special divine potency, wherein lies the power to alter material creation towards a particular outcome. What else is ritual? Spiritual ritual, religious ritual. What else is it for? We'll allow the anthropologist to chime in momentarily. So the next morning, a radiant Ṛcīka presents these two bowls to his beautiful bride Satyavati, and explains, he gives careful instructions. He's clear. He's keen to disambiguate between bowl A, the Brahmin bowl, if you will, the sagacious stew, the soup of sages, and bowl B, breakfast of champions. Right? The the royal brew. Okay. The sage stew and the royal brew. Here we are. And Satyavati's like, delighted, you know. And so she goes off and she's like, well, this is a wonderful bonding experience. It's, I don't always agree. I rarely agree with the results of Freudian analysis because, in my view, the Freudian perspective accounts for a fragment of the human experience. But I always understand why there are individuals who are called to such analysis, because, of course, there is such a dimension in these tales as well. And so, anyhow, Doctor thinks, what a wonderful bonding experience. Myself and Mama will conceive together, will together conceive by imbibing the brew, empowered by my sagacious groom. And so she's off to see Mama. And her mother, of course, was of an ancient royal house. And she was quite concerned with, keeping up with the Patels, keeping up with whomever. She was quite concerned with status. What is the highest echelon of status? Royalty. So, of course, this is a concern of hers, a preoccupation of hers. She was perhaps more insecure than most, not uncommon in her circles, but she was very proud of her position, and she wanted the best. She was gunning for greatness. Rajas, fire, passion, desire. And so typically we see others through our own natures. When they're individuals who are relatively or greatly evolved, they're able to actually suspend or abate or displace their ego sense while they're hearing a story, while they're counseling, while they're receiving a question, and there's a space for that person's experience. They could suspend their sort of camera one ego sense and pan to camera two to view the conversation of the person. They can get themselves out of the way to leave space for the other person and space for wisdom, etc., etc. Yet, the vast majority of human beings project their own ego sense and ego crud onto those with whom they speak. And so, if you are insecure or perhaps, to use an example, hedonistic in some sense, you might project promiscuity onto your partner. What were you doing last night? Well, I told you I was working late. I mean, there might be much more to the dynamic, but either way, the people who have ill intent will either project that onto others, or they will seek out those who are gullible so they can have their way. Either way, it's a function of who they are, not who the other person is. Okay. There's much to be said about this, but this queen, being kind of sort of concerned with one-upmanship and prestige and position, desiring the best, she figured, look, obviously men are self-interested, people are self-interested. Obviously, this son-in-law sage man that he is will save the best for himself and have the better son. He's obviously created the better brew for himself and Satyavati. Like, this is not uncommon where we see ego that is so toxic that one is even begrudging or envious of one's own children. Um, uh, One wishes this were not uncommon. One wishes this was uncommon. This is not uncommon. Many people have had this experience, unfortunately. So, I mean, even if this is the case, assuming you projected your card into the situation and you think, okay, the better brew, he's kept for himself. Well, perhaps a sensible or charitable person. Well, he's the one wielding the Shakti, if you will, and why wouldn't I want a great grandson? You know, why not give my daughter the best? But nope, nope, unbridled ego. I want the best for me. And so what does she do? Well, you guessed it. She swaps the bowls of porridge unbeknownst to Satyavati. Okay. So then they imbibe, the sage stew and the royal brew, except it's the queen who imbibes the sage stew, and it's Satyavati, the sage's wife, who imbibes the royal brew. And they both conceive and are with child instantaneously. Wow, that's some potent porridge, let me tell you. Potent indeed, not impotent. Anyhow, Satyavati returns to her sage husband, Ṛcīka, and her face is radiant with a child she's now carrying. And she enters the forest hut and she beams her husband a radiant smile. He can tell in the blinking of an eye that she's conceived. And Ṛcīka is delighted to see her, returns her smile. But a split second later, he notices in the first nanosecond that she's pregnant. And then in the very second, he notices something else. Such is the power of divine sight, apparently. And although he was delighted to see her, his face turns ashen. He's a little bit unnerved, surprised, shocked. And, Satyavati being perceptive, or at very least empathetic, sort of picks up this sort of jolt of surprise that her beloved is experiencing. And she's like, what is it? What's the matter? Did the porridge not take? I feel something changing in me. I don't know if it's a placebo effect, but I feel changed by the process for sure. I'm fairly certain I could sense a child growing within me. And her husband, the sage, says, well, yes, it definitely took. My dear Satyavati, you are radiant with child. Of course. But tell me this. Did you take the porridge that I had allotted for you? Or did you consume the one that I specified was for your royal mother? Satyavati's like, well, this wizardry is beyond me. This isn't my domain. I certainly wouldn't mix prescription drugs without the counsel of a skilled pharmacist or chemist across the pond. No, I wouldn't meddle. What ridiculousness, what calamity, what confusion might there be? Who knows? I'm not mixing prescription drugs. I took the one that you prescribed, of course. I gave my mother the one you specified was hers, and I kept the one that you specified was mine. What's going on? What's happening? So Ṛcīka, the sage, takes a moment and closes his eyes and focuses his inner sight to see what he can see. Right? He then saw what had happened. His mother-in-law had switched the porridges. My dear Satyavati, thinking her concoction inferior to yours, your ambitious mother switched them unbeknownst to you. But I infused your mother's potion with the qualities of a warrior, as per your father's request. Hers was to have been a child befitting a great royal house. And in your potion, I infuse the qualities of a Brahmin or a sage, you can say. I'll conflate the two for now, for the podcast, anyhow. Compassion, gentleness, purity, truth. But now your royal mother has conceived a Brahmanic child, and you, my dear, have conceived a great warrior. My goodness. This mixing and matching of natures. What do we get? What do we get when we mix red and white? We get pink, perhaps. Anyhow, dear Ṛcīka, best of sages, husband of mine, surely there's something you can do. Wow, I had no idea. I've got to have a little stern talking to with Mama when next I see her, but now it's all quite confused. I mean, what do we do? Certainly we're not going to swap the babies at birth, although I think that would have been a creative solution had she kind of just brought them to term and she did the old switcheroo to undo Mama's switcheroo. But no. Life is more complex than that. So she asks her husband to use his divine power in order to rectify the situation. You cast a spell, and now Tsarai cast yet another spell to rectify the situation. I would love nothing more than to bear your Brahmanical son befitting a sage as exalted as yourself. Could you perhaps defer the effects of the potion for a generation, so that I could bear you a wise and sagacious son, and my mother instead birth a fierce warrior? Ṛcīka was able to grant Satyavati's wish, and they brought forth another great sage. So their son was Jamadagni. And Jamadagni's son, Paraśurāma, is a famous figure indeed. Paraśurāma means Rama with an axe. And that axe isn't there just to harvest kusha grass for the rituals. Let me tell you, Paraśurāma, although born and raised a Brahmana, becomes a very powerful warrior indeed. So powerful, he said, to have wiped out 21 generations of Kshatriyas. A story for another day. But Paraśurāma is a great figure indeed. He is even one of the great arms trainers in the Mahabharata. If I'm not mistaken, it is Paraśurāma himself who is Bhishma's guru, his arms guru. Anyhow, the problem was to further generation. And we have this Brahmana who takes up the work of a Kshatriya, of a warrior. Right? This is what I call the dharmic double helix. These two divergent strands of dharma, especially with respect to violence. The duty of the warriors to wield violence for protection of state, and the duty of the sage or the Brahmana is to wield non-violence, is to abstain from violent force. And so we've got this little weaving of the dharmic double helix with these two strands in one personage, such as Paraśurāma, who has, he embodies these dual legacies, which need to come together. And this very much is the conversation of the coming together of classical Hinduism, because classical Hinduism has one parent, a Vedic parent, historical Vedic, which is very much about running society properly, performing rituals, wielding force where needed, and this other ascetic parent, this Upanishadic parent, which is all about ahimsa, himsa, himsa. Yes. And to this day, we've got even to modern day, we've got various interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita. Is it to be taken literally or figuratively? Yes. So this tension is, to my mind, the dharmic double helix is the DNA at the heart of Hinduism. Very much so. Okay. Due to the porridge exchange, Satyavati's royal mother gave birth to King Viśvāmitra. This is the backstory of great exalted figures in tradition in Indian myth, Paraśurāma and Viśvāmitra. For those of you who are interested, there is an episode here where I go into detail about the story of Sage Viśvāmitra. But Viśvāmitra is born a king, and he is the first and last person in the history of Indic lore who, through extraordinary tapasya austerity, gains the boon of becoming a Brahmin sage. It's a lovely, charming, powerful tale where he covets the cow of sage Vasishta. He covets the wish-fulfilling cow and tries to take her by force and cannot, because the sage's Brahmanical powers supersedes his brute force. Such is the story of Viśvāmitra. But the story and the encounter of Vasishta and Viśvāmitra also just weaves this wonderful tension between the Dharmic double helix, because Vasishta is a sattvic sage who needs to learn to protect himself. And Viśvāmitra is a Rajasic king who needs to learn to curb his desire and his appetites and to become a sage. You know, Paraśurāma and Viśvāmitra are inversions of each other. The former was born a Brahmin but adopted the ways of the warrior, while the second was a warrior and king who adopts the ways of a sage. This story is told in the stories behind the poses, pertaining to its namesake, Ṛcīkāsana, an inversion. Gee, do you think the inverted pose and the story of inversions, relate to each other in some way? The pose itself, for those interested in the poses, involves a deep inversion, much like the inversion at the heart of the story. Right. Yet also, like the story of Ṛcīka, one needs to stay grounded with a single foot firmly planted on the ground. One also needs to balance one's weight between two hands, which represent the two types of power discussed in the story. The Brahman's power is concentrated in the greatest sages of India. This is, in the literary imagination. I don't necessarily mean historically, but that's a different question. We're speaking literarily or archetypally. The warrior's power finds its apex in the king. These two manifestations of power, one outer physical secular, the other inner spiritual sacred, need to be brought into balance. These two manifestations of power. Do we notice what happens when those who wield secular power are bereft of spiritual awareness? Conversely, do we see what happens when those who are so-called spiritually seeking are utterly unrooted in reality, material reality? Both are required. We have two hemispheres of the brain for a reason. Okay. These two types of power, they complement each other. So too does experiential and intellectual learning. They complement each other. The story of Ṛcīka is a story of the reversal of the power roles of sages and kings. And perhaps in this tale, there's some wisdom you can wield in your own life in terms of thinking through, contemplating, examining the unexamined life, indeed, examining your tendencies, your temperament, your duty, and where you need to learn the opposite of your comfort zone in order to become more whole. Are you full of rajas? In need of a smidgen of sattva? Or are you soaked in sattva and need to learn to embrace rajas? Well, that's for you to figure out. You and or a skilled professional to figure out. Feel free to reach out if I may be of service. I hope this tale was as enjoyable to hear as it was to tell, at very least. I'm Dr. Raj Balkaran, and you can find me at indianwisdomschool.com or rajbalkaran.com. Until next time, take care of yourself. Namaste.